Welcome, everybody. Hello. Good evening. I'm Roberta Winitzer. I'm a library trustee, and on behalf of the trustees, welcome to the library. It's been our pleasure this year to be working with Climate Action Brookline, especially during this week. And I'd like to immediately turn the program over to Paul Harris, who is there.
Right here. Hi, everybody, and I'm going to try using the microphone here, and then you can hear out the difference. So I'm going to use the microphone, and then pass the microphone off in a minute to Frank Smisek, and then I'll introduce, after Frank gives a few comments, I'll introduce the panelists that we have here today. And first I wanted to mention that this whole week is Climate Week in Brookline. Started last Saturday and it goes through this coming Sunday. And how many of you have seen the map like this that shows Climate Week events? There are more of those outside on the table. Tomorrow, for example, right here in this room, we have Kristen Kimball, who's the author of The Dirty Life, a memoir of farming, food, and love. And that's the book that's been chosen by Brookline Reads this year. There's kind of a collaboration between Brookline Reads and Climate Action Brookline in reading that book. And then we have the author here tomorrow night. There's also a panel on urban agriculture, feeding our community, which will be at the Coolidge Corner Library this coming Saturday from 1 to 2 p.m. and many other things. I want to thank Roberta and the other library trustees, and we're here at the Brookline Public Library that they're hosting us here. I also want to thank Mike Stone, who's in the front right there, who's really coordinated this whole panel, and thank you so much for all the time you've put into this, Mike. And Mary Dewitt, who's right over here, who's really overseeing the whole Climate Week, quite an amazing series of events. I'm now going to, well, first of all, even before Frank, there's one other person who's actually not here tonight, but I want to give a few quotes from him. His name is Barack Obama. And Barack Obama, 9 days ago, gave his second inaugural address, and I just wanted to read one paragraph from that speech. And I've got all the words exactly right because I got the speech from the White House website. This is it, Barack Obama's inaugural speech, and here's the quote. "We, the people, still believe that our obligations as Americans are not just to ourselves, but to all posterity. We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations. Some may still deny the overwhelming judgment of science, but none can avoid the devastating impact of raging fires and crippling drought and more powerful storms. The path towards sustainable energy sources will be long and sometimes difficult, but America cannot resist this transition. We must lead it." So President Obama's heart seems to be in the right place. The challenge is how to translate that commitment into national policy, which effectively addresses climate change. And as Seth was saying to me before a few minutes ago when we were talking, the problem is not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The problem is reducing greenhouse gas emissions enough. And that's what national policy needs to do, is to show real leadership in addressing the real problem. So I'm going to start by having our Brookline representative, our own Representative Frank Smisek, who's chair of the Massachusetts House Global Warming and Climate Change Committee. And as the committee chair, he seeks to ensure that all legislation relating to transportation, energy, capital infrastructure, and economic development policy takes into consideration the challenge of global climate change and includes appropriate mitigation and adaptation measures. So I'm going to start with just a few minutes of Frank Smizik, and then I'll introduce our three panelists for tonight. Frank.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good evening, and thank you for coming to this great Brookline event. As many of you know, and Paul just said, I'm the chairman of the House Committee on Global Warming and Climate Change, and we work with other committees. Actually, I think we're the only one left, the only committee left in the United States in the legislatures that has a committee on climate change. I'm not sure whether they're going to move out, come aboard when we have more interest in this issue. Maybe the president's comments will cause that to happen. Massachusetts has really been a leader in climate change and addressing it. Two environmental laws from 2008 have provided the tools that we needed to address climate change. This was the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Green Communities Act. The Global Warming Solutions Act requires the Commonwealth to achieve emission reductions between 10 to 25% below statewide 1990 greenhouse gas levels. They have to do that by 2020. And 80% below 1990 greenhouse emissions levels by 2050. As a companion to this law, the Green Communities Act promotes a dramatic expansion of energy efficiency, supports the development of renewable energy resources, creates a newer, greener state building code, removes barriers to renewable and energy installations, stimulates technology innovation, and helps consumers reduce their electric bills. The Green Communities Program is an important piece of this law, provides funding and support for energy efficiency and renewable energy opportunities to Massachusetts municipalities. As of now, there are 110 green communities throughout the state, and I'm proud to say that Brookline is one of them. Last session, we passed an act relative to competitively priced electricity. We write such hard titles. Which updated the 2008 laws. This law will help give ratepayers more reliability in their rates and will increase opportunities for renewable energy development. Utility companies are required to enter into an escalating number of long-term contracts for power purchase from renewable sources. The contract length is created and has to be from 10 to 20 years, which means that electricity prices will be more consistent. It also creates a downward pressure on electricity prices because after the wind and the solar companies pay off their cost of construction, the cost for the solar and for the wind is nothing. So those kinds of costs are going to help us in the long run. Furthermore, the law helps reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and encourages our clean energy economy by allowing more net metered renewable power into the grid. The clean energy industry has been one of the fastest growing sectors of our economy. The Clean Energy Center released a report last year that found over 70,000 people working in the clean energy sector, representing 1.7% of the total Commonwealth workforce. The clean energy sector employment rate has grown by 11.2% from 2011 to 2012. This is 10 times faster than the growth of other industries in Massachusetts. In an effort to highlight these successful industries and focus legislative attention on this sector, Senator Jamie Eldridge and I started the Green Economy Caucus. The Green Economy Caucus helps promote legislation and policies that encourage economic growth and job creation based on sustainable development aimed at improving economic, environmental, and social well-being. Last session, the caucus held events that focused on advanced water technology, green chemistry, recycling, and renewable energy. I'm looking forward to continuing the work on this caucus in the next session. In the upcoming year, my colleagues and I will prioritizing, a hard word, transportation financing and investments. I will be working to ensure that any new laws will lessen our transportation sector's greenhouse gas emissions and will also enable us to adapt our infrastructure to a new climate. On the agency side, there are two committees based on the Global Warming Solutions Act that are dealing with mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation essentially means that these are things that will happen and that have happened already, and we have to do something in our climate, in our building of structures or putting up seawalls to address these things that have been caused by climate change already. Mitigation is just stopping what we know in the future will be a very serious problem because of the high emissions and high greenhouse gas levels in our air. As for the situation nationwide, I think there are a few elements at play. As Paul said, well, during the president's first administration, I visited Washington, D.C. several times as part of an organization of state legislators trying to reach federal consensus on climate change. We're not very successful because the congressmen and senators, Democrats and Republicans, did not recognize the high importance of climate change. It was usually like the 6th to 10th most important issue for these legislators. Many had close ties to the coal industry, oil and gas refineries, and other fossil fuel activities were located in their states. There was really no convincing them, and the effort was not successful. These public officials were controlled by the companies and the employees who worked in these industries. In a new effort a couple weeks ago, as Paul said, we heard President Obama highlight climate change and the promise of clean energy in his inaugural address. Now we're left guessing whether this declaration will translate into action. I can't give you any predictions. It's going to be very, very difficult. The other looming question is whether John Kerry's ascension to the Secretary of State will leave a lasting impact on our country's climate policy. The decision on the Keystone XL pipeline will come to him eventually, and I'm sure we're all anxious to see what happens. I'd like to thank Climate Action Brookline for inviting me to speak. I hope my comments give you an overview of what we're trying to accomplish in the legislature. And as always, feel free to contact my committee staff or myself with any questions you may have. Thank you very much. The Global Warming Solutions Act requires the Commonwealth to achieve emission reductions between 10 to 25% below statewide 1990 greenhouse gas levels. They have to do that by 2020. And 80% below 1990 greenhouse emissions levels by 2050. As a companion to this law, the Green Communities Act promotes a dramatic expansion of energy efficiency, supports the development of renewable energy resources, creates a newer, greener state building code, removes barriers to renewable and energy installations, stimulates technology innovation, and helps consumers reduce their electric bills. The Green Communities Program is an important piece of this law, provides funding and support for energy efficiency and renewable energy opportunities to Massachusetts municipalities. As of now, there are 110 green communities throughout the state, and I'm proud to say that Brookline is one of them. Last session, we passed an act relative to competitively priced electricity. We write such hard titles. Which updated the 2008 laws. This law will help give ratepayers more reliability in their rates, and will increase opportunities for renewable energy development. Utility companies are required to enter into an escalating number of long-term contracts for power purchase from renewable sources. The contract length is created and has to be from 10 to 20 years, which means that electricity prices will be more consistent. It also creates a downward pressure on electricity prices, because after the wind and the solar companies pay off their cost of construction, the cost for the solar and for the wind is nothing. So those kinds of costs are going to help us in the long run. Furthermore, the law helps reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and encourages our clean energy economy by allowing more net metered renewable power into the grid. The clean energy industry has been one of the fastest growing sectors of our economy. The Clean Energy Center released a report last year that found over 70,000 people working in the clean energy sector, representing 1.7% of the total Commonwealth workforce. The clean energy sector employment rate has grown by 11.2% from 2011 to 2012. This is 10 times faster than the growth of other industries in Massachusetts. In an effort to highlight these successful industries and focus legislative attention on this sector, Senator Jamie Eldridge and I started the Green Economy Caucus. The Green Economy Caucus helps promote legislation and policies that encourage economic growth and job creation based on sustainable development aimed at improving economic, environmental, and social well-being. Last session, the caucus held events that focused on advanced water technology, green chemistry, recycling, and renewable energy. I'm looking forward to continuing the work on this caucus in the next session. In the upcoming year, my colleagues and I will prioritizing, a hard word, transportation financing and investments. I will be working to ensure that any new laws will lessen our transportation sector's greenhouse gas emissions and will also enable us to adapt our infrastructure to a new climate. On the agency side, there are two committees based on the Global Warming Solutions Act that are dealing with mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation essentially means that these are things that will happen and that have happened already, and we have to do something in our climate, in our building of structures or putting up seawalls to address these things that have been caused by climate change already. Mitigation is just stopping what we know in the future will be a very serious problem because of the high emissions and high greenhouse gas levels in our air. As for the situation nationwide, I think there are a few elements at play. As Paul said, during the president's first administration, I visited Washington, D.C. several times as part of an organization of state legislators trying to reach federal consensus on climate change. We're not very successful because the congressmen and senators, Democrats and Republicans, did not recognize the high importance of climate change. It was usually like the 6th to 10th most important issue for these legislators. Many had close ties to the coal industry, oil and gas refineries, and other fossil fuel activities were located in their states. There was really no convincing them, and the effort was not successful. These public officials were controlled by the companies and the employees who worked in these industries. In a new effort a couple weeks ago, as Paul said, we heard President Obama highlight climate change and the promise of clean energy in his inaugural address. Now we're left guessing whether this declaration will translate into action. I can't give you any predictions. It's going to be very, very difficult. The other looming question is whether John Kerry's ascension to the Secretary of State will leave a lasting impact on our country's climate policy. The decision on the Keystone XL pipeline will come to him eventually, and I'm sure we're all anxious to see what happens. I'd like to thank Climate Action Brookline for inviting me to speak. I hope my comments give you an overview of what we're trying to accomplish in the legislature. And as always, feel free to contact my committee staff or myself with any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
So now I'm going to begin introducing the panelists. And the format, the way this will go is that I will introduce one of the panelists, and then that person will speak for about 5 minutes. We told them to really keep it down, just a very brief introduction, highlighting some key issues. And then after they've all had their 5 minutes, then we'll have a brief conversation where I'll ask some questions and they can respond. We'll get the conversation going that way, and then we'll open it up to the audience as a whole. So the first person who's going to speak is Seth Kaplan. He's a Vice President for Policy and Climate Advocacy at the Conservation Law Foundation, where he focuses on fostering renewable energy, working for climate protection, and reducing the environmental impact of fossil fuel power plants. For those of you who are not familiar with the Conservation Law Foundation, the foundation since 1966 has used law, science, policy making, and the business market to find pragmatic, innovative solutions to New England's toughest environmental problems, such as cleaning up Boston Harbor, protecting ocean fisheries, expanding access to public transportation, and supporting a coal-free New England by the year 2020. So now, I think our panelists have all kind of said they would prefer not to use the microphone. So I'm going to save a little bit of greenhouse gases by turning off the microphone now. But if you don't hear them loudly enough, please raise your hand and we have the microphone here available. Okay, so Seth?
Great. Yeah, please let me know if you can't hear, or there's some seats up towards the front if you can't hear. Well, thank you very much, and I do have to, this is my one mild commercial, is to say that CLF is a member-supported organization, and Devin, Parrish in the back, is here from our membership department, and if you she has materials if you want to know about our work. And the thing is that I would just pick up on from Representative Smizek's great comments is we're very proud to have worked on the legislation that he talked about, the Green Communities Act, and I just refer to the one that passed last year as Green Communities 2, the updates to the Green Communities, and there's a lot of, we're very deep into the business of implementing that legislation. That one of the what some of the best people in government I know say that the passage of a law is an excellent starting point. Then you get into the really practical business of making it real, and the regulations, and making its impact felt in the world. So there's a lot more work to be done. And the last, before I get into the real substance here, I just remark that there was a mention of the panel on Saturday at the Coolidge Corner Library about urban agriculture. Jenny Rushlow, who does our farm and food work, will be there and talking about our Growing Green report that is available on our website on urban agriculture, and that should be a lot of fun and make you really, really hungry. To think about food policy work. So about a week ago, I was right next door at the school that a couple of my kids have gone to, and one of them still goes to, Pierce School, on the coldest day of the year, talking about global warming. Here we are a week later, and we're setting warmth records, and you got to wonder exactly what's going on here. And as we think about how to address our increasingly unstable climate and deal with the reality that we have over the last 100 years and increasingly over time, put enough emissions into the air so there are now kind of baked into the climate some very substantial and unavoidable effects. We got to think about what is next on the state, regional, and national level. And as Representative Smizek talked about, there is adaptation to deal with those changes, then there's mitigation to avoid the even worse things that will happen if we do not deal with that. And, you know, most of those effects will not be felt, those even worse effects won't be felt for some time. You know, although, you know, we do not want to be the guy that Stephen Colbert the other night said he wants to be, which is that he said that he doesn't want to be the kind of grandpa who spoils the kids by leaving them a habitable planet. You know, so, you know, we need to make that investment in the future. And the Massachusetts legislation does provide a framework, does provide a replicable model, which is a phrase we use a lot. Why does as a state, as a regional organization, why does our work matter? It matters because of reducing emissions here in New England, but it matters even more in terms of producing replicable model. And the Massachusetts legislation does provide that kind of replicable model for the nation, the world, to get really hyperbolic about it. The prospects of passing something like the Global Warming Solutions Act, a big bang kind of law, like a cap and trade law or a carbon tax on the national level, is not good, not to tell you something you already know. So, you know, well then what can we do? And, you know, I think I would urge folks to think about, on the national level, to remember there are certain unavoidable items that government always has to deal with. We just went through the adventure of the expiration of certain tax credits that's a key to our energy policy, you know, which was part of the tumult at the end of the last year. Transportation is a prime example of something where government's hand is forced into action. And, you know, one theme is the injection of climate into all of the work of government. You know, the old line that war is too important to be left up to generals. Well, global warming is too important to be left up to environmentalists. That we need, in the same way that, you know, to some degree every state employee thinks of their job as having an economic development aspect. Every state and every aspect of the actions of the government need to bear the imprint of climate. And I would just focus on the question of transportation, because transportation is that unavoidable infrastructure question. We're dealing with it now on the state level, and you should all be supportive of the governor's package.
Yep.
And, you know, and you should be telling your friends in other communities to tell their representatives, because, you know, we're taking care of you, to, you know, make their voices heard. You know, because we got, you know, just today, you know, we've got people in the Forest Hill Station dodging pieces of concrete falling off the roof. You know, we've got, you know, a green line that is unable to accommodate the 3-car trains that it should be able to because of voltage concerns. Transportation is among the unavoidables. We have an example on the energy front of what is possible through the Recovery Act, where there was basically, as part of the Recovery Act, you know, generally known as the stimulus, we had the largest injection of money into energy efficiency, basically in the history of humanity, under the guise of stimulating the economy. Now, you know, that, whether it's a good thing to turn the dial all the way in one direction and then turn it back down again is a whole other thing. But one area where government year in, year out makes investments is on the transportation front. And we need to make sure that part of the charter that gets injected into that debate about what we spend our infrastructure money on is the climate concern. And the two ways that transportation infrastructure decisions have a direct impact on climate is on where those investments get made, in terms of investments that buttress urban communities, you know, because it's a pretty sustainable model to build neighborhoods around transit hubs. Some of you have experience with a town that's history is exactly that. and also Newton. The other way that these decisions matter is in the type of transportation, the mode. And historically in this country, we have gone 80-20, 90-10 roads to transit in terms of the spending. And the push needs to be to move towards parity, and even beyond that, to investing more in the kinds of transportation that move people in a manner that is better for the climate. So that's my glimmer of hope that, well, we're not going to pass the Big Bang bill, a carbon tax or a cap and trade bill, that we can move forward a climate agenda within the other kinds of actions that government must inevitably take. EPA regulation of air pollution, the annual progress of transportation infrastructure bills and such. So it's hard to find hope, but there is some.
Thank you, Seth. As Seth mentioned, you mentioned your children going to school here in Brookline. And I want to mention that we're an example here of thinking globally and acting locally. All of our panelists live in Brookline, so there wasn't a lot of transportation money spent to get them here. And we're very proud of Brookline and the tremendous resources and wisdom and experience that we have here. And so Seth, Henry, Mindy, Frank, and our Climate Action Brookline staff as well. We all live in Brookline. The next person who's going to speak is Henry Lee. He's a senior lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's also director of the Environment and Natural Resources Program, co-chair of the International Infrastructure Program, and co-chair of the Energy Technology Innovation Policy Project. His recent research interests focus on energy and transportation, the geopolitics of energy, China's energy policy, and public infrastructure projects in developing countries. Henry.
Thank you. When I look at this problem, I have a wish, which was that there would be a study that would come out, there would be evidence that would come out, that would say that the climate problem is not so serious. The climate problem has been exaggerated. But if you look at the evidence and you say, well, if you looked at 2002, when you went back and read the studies from 1992, and you said, well, those 1992 studies that talked about gloom and doom, did they turn out to be as bad as it was predicted? It turned out worse in 2002. If you look at the 2002 studies, and you look at them today in 2013, and you say, well, did they turn out to be exaggerated? You find out they were basically underestimated the problem. If you look today at just the anecdotal evidence in the last year, 40% of the Arctic is now ice-free for at least 4 months a year. A ship went from Rotterdam to Shanghai, crossed the top of Russia, not in July, not in August, but in November this year. You look at the release out of Moscow yesterday that said more than 4 major pipelines of the Gazprom system have broken because of melting of permafrost. You look at the East Antarctic ice shield, you look at Greenland, and you look at the rate of melting of the glaciers, which were considered 10 years ago, oh, it can't possibly melt that fast. It's now melting faster than any prediction that we had 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And then you get Hurricane Sandy, which you all lived through and you've seen. So the evidence of all of this happening within 1 year, the probability that it is not related to climate change is absolutely infinitesimal. So you look at these numbers and you say, something's happening there, and which would basically be about a 1.5 degree centigrade increase. And all of those impacts that I've mentioned would be significantly worse. Why don't we act to this? Why haven't we reacted? And I'm no more optimistic than Seth is about the Congress taking this on. I think there's three things, and I think we have to come to grips with them. First, while President Obama made a very compelling speech about how we had to act to prevent the ecological damage for the future generations, it's really hard to get people to pay for future generations. People say, look, I'm not doing so well right now. We're in a tough economic climate. Am I willing to pay significantly higher prices for energy so that my grandkids can do better? That's a tough sell around the world. It's great on rhetoric, but it's hard when you actually ask people to pay the bill. The second is, can I tell you exactly what the climate will be in 2030, 2040, 2050? No, I can't tell you exactly. And therefore people say, without uncertainty, well, we'll take our chances. This is, I think, a very risky course to take. And the third thing you're going to deal with now is you've got cheap gas out there, and I think the probability of having cheap oil in the next couple of years is also very high, and I can get into that in the Q&A period if you want. So it's harder to make the case for more expensive renewables when the fossil fuels prices keep going down. What should the president do? And I'm just going to throw out a couple of things, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A. I don't think there is a constituency in the Congress to pass a comprehensive climate bill. I don't think there's a constituency to put a price on carbon, and I think that's, if I had to pick one thing that if I were dictator I'd like to do, which would be put a price on carbon. But I don't see it happening in this climate right now in this country. I would try to do four things if I were President Obama, and I think they're doable. First, the number one culprit in climate is coal. We have got to stop burning as much coal. And you've got a number of regulatory initiatives by EPA that are, most of which are now in the court system, but will come out in the next 2 years. And the implementation of these, and there are a few other regulatory actions that EPA could take, I think a goal of reducing coal consumption in the United States by 15 to 20% in the second Obama administration is feasible. And I think it's a goal that if I were the president, I would take. Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be a lot of pushback from coal-burning utilities and coal companies. But I think it is feasible, and you cannot deal with the climate problem if you don't deal with the coal problem. Second, I would deal with black carbon. There's a study out just last week that if you could reduce the emissions of black carbon, you could, which is primarily from diesel fuel, you could reduce over the next 30 years the rate of increase in temperature by 0.5 degree to 3/4 degree. That would buy you important time to develop the technology mix of the future, which is my third point, which is I think technology innovation is critical. Most people in Congress, even those who are not big fans of putting a price on carbon, do believe in stimulating energy technology innovation. Yet the United States is putting up half the money that China is putting up, and China's GDP is about 1/6 of the United States. So there is, and I could go, I'll expand on this if you want in the Q&A, but I think we need an aggressive program for energy technology innovation to develop the energy portfolio for the next 50 years for a world that is going to be constrained by climate change. And my last point is the same one Seth made, which is because there's so much momentum in the system, I think you have to address adaptation. The fact that we had Hurricane Sandy destroying the subway system in Lower Manhattan, destroying the telecommunication system in New Jersey and in Long Island and Lower Manhattan, to the point that none of the ATM machines were working for almost 2 weeks. The fact that both our transportation systems, our telecommunication systems, and our energy systems ignore the realities that we're going to face in terms of the impacts of climate change. I think we need a whole new infrastructure program in the United States that addresses this. And the notion of simply rebuilding what we had after Hurricane Sandy And thinking that you're not going to get another Hurricane Sandy in the next 10 or 15 years, I think is being naive. And I think we really need to change our infrastructure policy in America. Thank you, and I'll be glad to expand on any of these in the Q&A.
Thank you, Henry. The third panelist here today is Mindy Luber, and Mindy is president of CERES, which is the leading coalition of investors, environmental organizations, and other public interest groups working with companies and investors to build sustainability into the capital markets and address sustainability challenges such as global climate change. She directs the Investor Network on Climate Risk, a group of nearly 100 leading institutional investors managing together about $10 trillion, that's trillion with a T, in assets, that coordinates U.S. investor responses to the financial risks and opportunities of climate change. Before joining CERES, Mindy was administrator for the New England region of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Mindy.
Great, thanks, Paul. But most importantly, I am a Brookline resident, a Brookline mom. I probably know half of you from our kids on the soccer field, and I spend 100% of my time talking to corporate leaders or corporations and their senior leadership teams and investors, and not enough time talking to my friends, the people who are, I think, doing the hard work. And part of the reason that, despite what I could not agree more in terms of what Henry and Seth said, I think there is some room, there's a ray of hope here, and there's some room for optimism, and we ought to seize the moment. And let me talk about why. I mean, it could be delusional that I'm taking happy drugs because somehow I have to justify 70 hours a week. Last week I was in Abu Dhabi and doing a 100-hour week, and the week before. So it may be that I think we've got a shot now, because it's the only way to keep my sanity. But I actually do think there's a moment in time, and I think we have no choice but to believe this is a moment in time to actually make some progress. And the three reasons that I think we've got some opportunity, and we'll noodle them through together in the questions. One is, I think the president clearly did change the tone with the speech. Paul just read some of it, a few sentences. Now, speeches are great, soaring rhetoric is good, but unless you have an action plan to address it, it's just that, soaring rhetoric. And I'm with Frank, I don't know, let's wait and see. I was in Washington all day yesterday, met with the head of the Council on Environmental Quality and other folks in the White House, and I am not yet convinced there is a clear layout of plan and this is how we're going to get there. I mean, the reality is, though, if we do that, and everybody's imploring them to do that, the federal government has enormous ability. I'm going to come back to what they can do. But there are things to do without the United States Congress. I'm with Seth, I'm with Henry. We're not seeing a bill in the United States Congress in the next 12 months. It doesn't mean we ought not be building a movement to make sure we get that bill in 4 years. But let's not hold our breath. That said, I think that with administrative or regulatory changes, we could do a good deal of what we would do with a cap and trade or a tax on carbon, all of which must happen, should happen sooner rather than later, but likely will not happen for 4 years or so. But you got to build a movement to get to them, so let's make sure we're doing that. But I do think there's hope from President Obama, and I'll come back to more specifics. I do think that Hurricane Sandy, we are all wildly tired of hearing about it, but Hurricane Sandy changed the debate. The polls are different. I mean, we've got a problem that people can't touch, they can't feel, they can't smell. It's not like air pollution or water pollution, which many of us have worked on for the last 30 or 40 years. It is a different kind of problem. And what's complicated further is what we do in Boston impacts Rio de Janeiro, and what happens in Jamaica impacts Singapore, and most importantly, what's happening in China impacts the rest of the world. And China is growing at inordinate rates. Even though the United States has brought its carbon footprint down, some due to the economy and other measures, China is raising that footprint in ways that we can't even imagine. Building new airports, new manufacturing facilities, new homes, millions of people coming into the middle class, having microwaves, refrigerators, nothing that they ought not get, that they don't deserve to have, a cost of living that we've had. But it's changing the mix, and the problem, rather than getting better, is getting more substantial given what's going on in China and some of the other parts of the world. But nevertheless, back to the optimism, people are understanding. Hurricane Sandy put a face to it, it put a name to it, it put a reality to the fact that what scientists have been talking about may actually be very real, that we are seeing problems that are happening now in communities to people we know, for people who like Wall Street. When was the last time the New York Stock Exchange, other than 9/11, was shut down? I think it was about 80 years ago. I mean, what we saw in terms of homes damaged, people's damaged, has taken on new resonance. And the polling numbers following Hurricane Sandy are very compelling, and people saying we need to act on climate. We need to act on climate sooner rather than later. We need to reduce our carbon footprint by 80% by the year 2050, increase our renewables, increase our efficiency, and we need to do it now. And what I think is happening here in Brookline, and I spend most of my time in different places, is we are building a movement here. So everybody here in the room, and I don't think Brookline is representative. I think, you know, everywhere I go, if I even talk about Brookline, oh, the People's Republic of Brookline, we're progressive, we're, as far as I'm concerned, rational and reasonable. And what the folks here are doing at Brookline Climate Action is extraordinary. It is extraordinary. We ought to be proud to be part of it. The work that's getting done in homes, with businesses, at town meeting, in the state legislature, across the board, in the governor's office, so much is happening here. But we need to be thinking about building a movement now. So if we're going to ever pass a bill in the United States Congress, even if those of us who predict 4 years from now, you can't start building a movement a year before that. We've got to build a movement now, and that movement has to look different, feel different, and taste different. I mean, in large part, the environmental community spent hundreds of millions of dollars to pass Waxman-Markey, and we failed. And we failed in some part. I mean, there are lots of reasons, because it was environmentalist, and we could be marginalized, and we could be considered tree huggers. This has got to be the moral issue of our time. This is an issue about whether our kids have a future in reality. It is also the economic future of our economy. And while I would rather talk about the future of Abe and Jesse, my kids, and they probably played soccer or lacrosse with all of your kids, in the boardrooms that I address, I'm talking about the economics and how we can't build an economy. If you look at just 2011, $34 billion hit to the property and casualty insurance sector just in the United States from storm-related damage attributed to in the United States to climate change. In 2012, $50 billion hit to the property and casualty sector, a $50 billion bailout package that we just saw, and about $40 billion from taxpayers, because we become the insurance company of last resort. So when the private insurers say, I don't want to do flood insurance, it's too risky, and I don't want to do crop insurance, and I don't want to do the insurance on the shorelines of Florida and other, they just pull out. And then the federal government is the insurance company, that's us. So if you look at 2012 from storm-related damage, we're looking at well over $100 billion. Those are numbers we can't afford to go at every single day, and I think, like it or not, whether it's the most humane discussion, it is the discussion I think we need to have, and I think we can change the debate in the climate, and frankly, some members of the United States Congress, by looking at the financial impacts. When we're up in the Congress with my closest friends from the Union of Concerned Scientists or from Sierra Club, nobody's listening to us. When we're up there with Deutsche Bank and Lloyd's of London and Swiss Re and Prudential, people listen. So let's change the debate. Let's get this out of the tree hugger debate. People can call me that. But that's not what we're talking about. And how do we do that? So one is we do build a movement like what's going on here. We build moral outrage because it's outrageous. But we also have to make the economic case and clearly the scientific. So there are 4 or 5 things going on out there. There's the international policy debate. And I will say, even if we pass a national bill, and I'm not hopeful for this year, but I am 4 years from now, if we're not figuring out what to do about China and India, we could pass a bill till we turn blue in the face. I mean, we have got to be moving towards an international treaty. This is an international problem. At the federal level, though, I agree completely. We need a cap on carbon, and we need a price on carbon. Right now, we're sending dishonest market signals. We say carbon pollution costs 0. If something's free, you get a lot more of it, and we're getting a lot more of it. well, not a lot more in the United States. But I do think, even without a national bill or a federal bill, what could be done in the United States Congress through the EPA and through other agencies are profound, and we need to make sure those things happen. We need to make sure that the kind of regulations that the EPA put out for new generating facilities, new regulations are promulgated for present generating facilities. That could make a huge difference. Think about the auto pollution standards that we passed last year. Without the United States Congress, the average fuel efficiency of cars is going from 27 miles per gallon to 54. The impact of that is monumental. Didn't need the United States Congress, did it administratively. But even to do that, it's pressure on the president. We've got to make sure the right person gets into the EPA. There are things that can be done that will make a difference, and we need to be making sure that state legislators are telling the president and our members of Congress that we have got to move the agencies and do so now. State policy is very important. There's a movement nationally to get legislatures to pull back from standards for renewable energy. I mean, how could that possibly be? The legislatures that have passed renewable energy standards did a good thing, right? Well, wrong. There's a movement out there to try and pull that back. We've got to be mindful of what could be done in state legislatures. And then in communities, we've got to work at a city level, at a town level. What's going on in Brookline at town meeting and beyond is absolutely essential. And then where we spend a lot of time is how do we move the private sector? How do we get the world's largest companies and investors to realize that the financial implications of climate, not only to the insurance sector, but to the agricultural sector that took a bath from floods and droughts, to anybody who uses carbon. I was out doing a training for the GAPS board last month. They took a bath when the cotton crop died in Texas, as did half of the companies, the apparel companies. The list goes on and on. Every part of our economic sector is being impacted, and we need to convince those people that they should be advocating for policy because it's hitting their bottom line. I'm sorry that, I find myself talking more about financial bottom line than Abe and Jesse, but if that's the language that changes the debate, let's talk the language that changes the debate. So I want to stop here. I do believe we're making some progress. I do believe there are things we could do. I think if the president is good to his word, he needs to not only talk about it, but move the federal government to purchase different products, use renewable energy, get electric cars, change what they buy. The federal government in and of itself is an institution, and as a regulatory body, agency by agency, there's an enormous amount we can do. We need to build the debate. We need to change the debate. We need to be on local radio and TV talking about the implications of this. I mean, it's not so we could convince Frank Smizek he's 10 steps ahead, but we've got to be changing the debate that this has to be done now. It is not about killing jobs. It's about helping our economy. It is about building a future, and I do think it is time for the moral outrage that everybody in this room has. Much we could do. I think we're going to sit here 2 years from now realizing that we actually like fuel economy standards. We've made a big difference through what we can do for the power of the United States government, EPA, and so on. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chair here now, and ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We can go up until 8:30, and so I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for all of you to ask your questions. But just to get things started, I know a lot of people are focused on the Keystone XL pipeline, and Bill McKibben has said if that goes through, it's game over for the climate. He's organizing a massive demonstration, what he hopes will be a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C. on February 17th. And I'd just like to quickly get each of your thoughts about how important the Keystone XL pipeline is in terms of addressing climate change, what should be done, and what the likelihood is that is what will actually happen. I'll start with Mindy, and then Henry, and then Seth.
So the game over part is the following. The Keystone Pipeline largely is to move tar sands and other what I would call considerably dirty energy from places like Alberta, Canada, through to the United States, and then arguably, eventually, pipelines through to Asia. What's that?
It's an export project, yeah.
Exactly. And so the real key is if tar sands go forward, if the $80 billion that's being invested in Alberta to mine the worst of energy policies that are not only horrible for water, horrible for land use, but there is no program for how to deal with the greenhouse gas emissions that come from those tar sands. I do believe Hansen and others who say it is game over. So Keystone is one viable, they're going to come out with other pipelines. Believe me, it's only the first one. But stopping it is important, both practically and symbolically, as a way to say we don't want that dirty energy, we don't want the problems of the contamination from having the pipeline, but really making it easy to move energy that ought not to ever come out of the ground. The devastation of tar sands is worse than anything we've seen, and we've got to keep it in the ground. So will we kill Keystone? Two very quick comments. One is, I actually was feeling quite nervous that Secretary of State Clinton, for a lot of reasons, the decision to permit the pipeline goes through state and not through the EPA, that the President and Hillary Clinton were forecasting that they were going to let it go. They were going to let it go through. We now have John Kerry at the State Department, an avowed climate activist, and he is and deserves credit for many, many things. I don't know if the President has already cut a deal. I hope not, and I hope that, so I think that we've got a better shot at it today than we did 3 days ago, and that's great, and we've got to kill the pipeline. I mean, the fact that there's another big action and movement, and I've had to scratch my head, should I be going with Bill and other friends and get arrested? And given the work I do, it's probably not a good idea. But standing up with our friends in Washington in a mass rally and saying this ought not to happen, is a bad thing, is a great way to send a message. So we all need to be thinking about how to build the strength, the numbers, the movement of people saying this is not acceptable, we don't want it to happen. And let's help John Kerry have the strength to say no to a project that the governor of Nebraska has already approved, that many people like, that some labor folks think is about jobs. It is controversial, but it needs to be stopped, and each of us can have a role in doing just that.
I think there's a lot of symbolism around this, and I agree with what Mindy's saying. But I also think that this is not where the war is going to be won. If the Canadians can't move it through the United States, they're going to try to move it to the West. Actually, the West project is worse, to be honest with you, from an environmental perspective. And they've already got 2 projects where they're trying to move it to the east. The answer to this is to put a price on carbon. And if you avoid doing that, you're going to get another Keystone and another Keystone, and you'll have to fight each one of those. And people say, well, right now the carbon cost is 0. I don't think that's actually true. I think the carbon cost is actually probably quite high. This is a distribution problem. That cost is being paid by future generations. It's being paid by all those people who are in your insurance companies that you talk about. And it's going to get a lot higher. So the notion that nobody pays, I think, is a myth. It is being paid. And if you don't address that, you're going to be fighting Keystone fights from now until the next 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Phil McKibben does say is we can't keep playing whack-a-mole with pipelines. That, this is, sometimes we'll say derisively, oh, it's just symbolic. Well, yeah, it's really important in part because it's symbolic. And it's not just about Keystone XL. I mean, I joke with my friend Casey Golden, who basically has my job at Climate Solutions in the Pacific Northwest, that I worry about the upper right-hand corner and he worries about the upper left-hand corner. Their major job right now is fighting off coal export terminals in Washington State. And they just elected Jay Inslee, who's a major climate activist and a great guy, to be the governor of Washington State. So there's some real progress there, and I think they're going to have a committee. So there is some hope there. But the thing about it is this symbolic effort, and we've recently were pleased to help arrange for the Do the Math tour, visit to Boston, and fill up the Orpheum Theater, with no paid advertising at all. It's just incredible that people were banging on the doors looking for tickets. And basically, if you go to the website that the 350.org people have up, and Devin there in the back from CLF, that's a lot of her classmates from Middlebury, are the young people who started the whole 350 thing. And that has this math, Bill McKibben's math that it was laid out in the Rolling Stone article, and it's just very clear. I think Keystone XL is an example of this very painful logic that some companies are deeply invested in projects and resources where their economic incentives point them in a very, very bad direction. You know, Mindy does a great job. You know, the BICEP effort that you guys have put together is a real model for the world of harnessing those other companies. But the real ugly lesson of that math that you can look up on the 350.org website is that we have this group of coal and oil companies who their proven reserves, the oil and the coal that they have proven that they intend to burn, is beyond the capacity of the climate system. And there is quite honestly two choices. Either those companies are worth the billions in market capitalization that they're worth, or we survive. And both things can't happen. And it's very tough because it sounds like an anti-business message. But in much the same way, the last thing I'll say about this, Keystone XL, it's a lot like the fight against tobacco. Once upon a time, people who were opposed to the tobacco companies were tarred as being anti-business. It's like, well, no, I'm only opposed to businesses whose primary products that when used as directed kill people. And we need to distinguish that we are against the division of TransCanada that wants to build the Keystone XL. We're in favor of their wind farm business. They got a big wind farm business. But it's about steering those companies in the right direction.
Okay, Henry said that the cost actually is pretty great of using carbon. The problem is that the people who are using the carbon aren't the same people who are going to be paying the cost. And one big example on the international scale is Bangladesh, which will be one of the first countries that goes underwater if we have sea level rise. And I sat next to somebody from Bangladesh when I saw a film, Fierce Green Fire, was screened at one of at the Kennedy School. And I sat next to a woman from Bangladesh, and I said, "What will happen to the people of Bangladesh if the ice in the Antarctic and Greenland melts and the sea level rises?" And she said, "They will drown. That India's not going to take them, China's not going to take them." So there is a tremendous cost that people can pay for the use of carbon. So how do you respond? How can governments respond when you have a price that is very high but that's not paid by the people who use the product? And tobacco, again, is a good example, because with cigarettes you can say, well, they're going to have a lot of hospital costs and so forth that are going to have to be borne because people choose to buy cigarettes. And so we'll put a high tax on tobacco. It's called the Pigouvian tax. And carbon tax can also be thought of as a Pigouvian tax, that it's a tax that's put on a product so that the costs that are going to be borne by the public as a whole will actually be paid for by the people consuming the product. And so that brings us to the question of, suppose we did have a price on carbon in the United States that was appropriate, that really reflected what the cost really is to the public as a whole. What might that cost be? And let me start the other way around this time with Seth, and then Henry, and then Mindy.
Well, we looking for a number?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean, the British government actually does a pretty good job of coming up with the social cost of carbon and, you know, working that in. You know, I mean, there's the distinction between, you know, computing that social cost of carbon and coming up with a number that will have the intended effect. You know, I mean, I think, you know, we know that if you start getting into a carbon price of, you know, $20, $30 a ton, that you start to move things in the right direction. You know, and, you know, I gotta say, one of the examples of a company that's started to really do this is, I mean, you know, they ain't a perfect company, but National Grid actually includes, has carbon budgets for each of its divisions, as well as regular budgets. And staying within those carbon budgets and reducing them actually is tied to the compensation of the executives. You know, and that's an interesting sort of model of how to do that and how to push that down into the system. You know, because people are often motivated by what drives their paycheck.
Henry?
Well, I'm going to make myself real unpopular here. I think that if you're really going to make a difference, if you want to get those 50%, 80% goals that you've set, I think you're going to need a price around $200 a ton over time, not tomorrow, but working up to it. So it's not going to be cheap, but I will tell you that if you set the price, it will be the cheapest way of getting there. And I also tell you it will be cheaper than the damage that you are avoiding. But let me add one other thing that I think is really important, which is people saying, well, gosh, there's a really uncertainty about the climate costs in the future, and we don't want to do anything. I go back to the issue of going back to coal. We've done studies in the 1980s, and they're repeated in the 1990s, extensive studies on mortality and morbidity related to particle matter, small particles. Those figures are that about 35 to 40,000 Americans die every year because of this. There is no uncertainty about these numbers. And we don't ever talk about particles as being a major problem. If you address this and put a price on those particles, I mean, you look at the studies that have been done, and you would have to have about a 400% increase in coal prices to actually come close to mirroring the costs, the health costs that are created by coal burning. And it seems to me that if you look at the immediate problems, we need to address that, and that would have a big step towards dealing with the climate problem and reducing coal. So one of the things that you actually got an immediate problem where there's no uncertainty, which is this whole question of particles. So yes, it's expensive over time. Yes, but I think it's lower than what the cost will be. And I must say, I want to advertise. I think. I can't prove that. But everything I see and everything you look at. What's the cost of removing 1/2 of Bangladesh? I can't imagine that it's one of those Nordhaus prices of $13.50. So I feel pretty confident that, and I do think if I look at the alternatives and what they're going to cost right now, $200 is about what you're going to have to get to.
And one of the things that we need to remind everybody is if we put a tax on carbon, that money all stays here, whether it's at federal level or state level or local level. If there's a tax on carbon, that money stays within that government. So it's not like sending the money off to the Middle East. It's money that's still available here to be used, but it provides the kind of incentives that we need for people to reduce their use. Henry, do you have any idea if we had a
Do you want to go to Mindy?
No, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question.
All right,
first,
okay.
and then a follow-up question. If we had a $200 per ton carbon price, can you give any idea what would be the impact of that on, say, a gallon of gasoline or on electricity prices, that kind of thing? How would it translate into?
About $2 on gasoline. It would probably quadruple the price of coal, which would be the one that would most heavily hit. Probably 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour on electricity.
Okay.
All of which, particularly if you sequence it over time, is not going to be overwhelming. In fact, if you look at, we did a study a few years ago on transport, and we did a question. We said, well, what would it take to have a 20% reduction in carbon emissions from the transport sector? And we found that there was about a $3.50 tax sequenced over time on top of the EIA or DOE estimate of $5 a gallon for 2030. Now, I got roasted by Rush Limbaugh for a week and a half for that study, which I was very proud of that. But the reality is that would have an effect of 0.2% impact on GDP by 2030 if it's sequenced in.
Good, okay, Mindy.
I think it's one of the most important things we can do. I mean, right now, we want the capital markets to work, but everything's priced, or things are priced inappropriately. Carbon pollution has an inordinate expense to society. People love talking about that as externalities. Those are real risks. They are on balance sheet costs. They're real risks, and we need to price them in. And one way to do it is, if carbon pollution costs society, and just think about it, $100+ billion for storms, just as hits from the insurance sector. It doesn't include losses to every company. Think about the additional losses from Hurricane Sandy, to people's homes, to businesses that were shut down, to public transportation. That's one storm. There's massive costs. So mitigating those costs are huge. We need to put the right price signals in place. Taxing bad things makes sense. It worked with cigarettes. Cigarettes used to be 25 cents when I used to buy them from my father 50 years ago, and now they're like $8.50 or so. I mean, people are still buying them, but it does have an inhibiting factor. Gas in Europe costs a lot more than it does here. We need to price things correctly, or we'll keep getting more dirty fuels. Coal has a huge price. We need to price it correctly. People are saying natural gas is the answer to our future. It is the bridge fuel, it's the new fuel, and it's very cheap, and we all love it. It wouldn't be very cheap if we put in the right price signals. We need to have regulations regulating fracking, because every time we ruin a water supply, or every time there's emissions flaring off the process, we make something else work. We need to price things in the reality that they exist and that we see them. And so pricing things honestly and putting a cost on carbon emissions, because they cost us as a society enormous amounts beyond which we can calculate, is a minimum of what we need to do. And whatever price Henry says makes sense, I'm all for it.
And let me just go further. I want to just pick up on a very, very local example of an absurdity in policy. That, we got fracking, but, we've done a lot of work recently about gas leaks. The gas company, all of the gas utilities in Massachusetts, at the end of the year, totaled up how much gas they have lost. The difference between what went in the front of the system and what they sold. And then they report to the Department of Public Utilities how much gas they lost. And then they are allowed to increase the rates that get charged to the customers to compensate them as if that gas was sold. That's how gas regulation works. Okay? Now just consider the economic incentive of that for a second. So there's all kinds of micro examples of this of getting these pricing signals right.
And of course, if we had that $200 a ton carbon price, then all the renewable sources of energy become so much more economically viable.
They become competitive.
Okay. So now let's open it up to the audience. John, right?
Yeah, first, just a brief comment about the tobacco analogy. The difference is that, yes, fewer people smoke cigarettes in the United States, but Philip Morris is doing fine. The reason is that they have a huge campaign to get people in India, China, all the less developed nations smoking, so their financials are doing great. So the corporations that are befouling our air and water here, we can't just move it to other countries. That doesn't help the problem at all. So they will resist, I think, even more than Philip Morris did. So the challenge is even greater. That's the comment. My question is, building on what mainly Henry and Mindy have said, the issue of, I guess, ecosystem services and true wealth. To me, this, the black soot, I have asthma. I'd love to get rid of it, and I know it's worse when I come back home after a vacation here in Boston, and it's a black soot problem. This is wealth. My health would be better. This is not, in a sense, a price people are sacrificing to pay. The people who get jobs working to solve these problems would be earning money, and they would be doing it, improving the quality of life of every single one of us. So how can we turn around that headset about that? This is not a cost, it's a benefit.
Good.
jobs. Jobs here in the United States, not jobs in China necessarily, and we've got to frame all these problems of they're about our health, but they're also about our local, state, and federal economy. And we don't need to gin up those numbers. They're very real, they exist, they're clear. Not acting on climate, the numbers are so profoundly more than even a $200 a ton tax.
Well, let me give you something very concrete that you can do to protect your own health. Today, EPA sent up to the White House the Tier 3 gasoline regulations that would cut in half the amount of sulfur in gasoline. And we are waiting to see if the Office of Management and Budget and the White House speedily moves forward in putting those into the Federal Register and making them enforceable rules. We've had tremendous success in getting sulfur out of diesel fuel and getting sulfur out of all kinds of fuels. But, you know, and I know that from an economist's point of view, the pricing tool is a better one, and I would agree that in an ideal world, that's what you would use. However, we need to use the tools that we have available to us. And the handle that we have, that we can grab right away, is the regulatory tool. And something like those sulfur and the Tier 3 rules for gasoline. And we need to exert bottom-up pressure. Those fuel economy regulations that have gone into effect on the federal level, the spark that started that was a woman named Fran Pavley on her first day as a member of the California State Assembly, dropping a bill into the hopper to regulate carbon dioxide from vehicles, which then started a whole chain of events that led up to the northeastern states adopting the standards after California did, and the Fed's been following along. So we need to exert that upward pressure. I gotta tell you, I think pricing in ecosystem services, putting a true price on these things is great, and you gotta do it right. You need to deal with very complex issues around international trade to make sure that you are not just exporting the pollution, but the first step is using the tools that we have in hand, which is something like EPA regulation.
I guess I would just, you know, I think you've stated the problem quite clearly in the question, but the reality is that the cost to you of the effect on your you know, pulmonary system and your effect on breathing and the fact that you have all of these health problems, when somebody buys diesel fuel, they don't pay for that. And I think that's important. Second thing I would say is you look at the melting in the Arctic right now. And one of the things, if you've ever been up to Greenland, or if you've ever been up in the Arctic area, and you look at the snow, particularly in the summer, you see all these little black specks all through it. And what you learn in first year of physics in high school is that when you have black absorbs heat and white reflects heat. So you have a lot of black specks, you melt a lot faster. I don't know how much faster the Arctic is melting because of basically black carbon, but there's no question that it's melting faster because you have it. Now my last point that I would make is I think that the CAFE regulations are probably the best thing that Obama has done. I think it is really terrific. But a world in which you are, those regulations are taking effect of basically $6 gasoline is quite different in the impact of those regulations in a world of $3 gasoline. And if you have cheap gasoline and strong regulations, and the regulations increase the price of the car, let's say a couple of $1,000, which is what EPA predicts, people are going to hold on to it. You won't get the rate of penetration. So you need to get the price instrument as well as the regulatory instrument. You don't have them together. You can't have one without the other, in my opinion.
Other questions? Yes.
What's the story about the subsidies? How come we're still subsidizing the oil and the gas companies, and what's the leverage for reality check on that?
Well, I think we've all tried to at least equalize some of those subsidies, and that has been, I think, one of the greatest problems and why we have the fuel mix we do. I mean, when we look at, we were just able to collectively, and I'm sure many people in this room were part of it, pass the the extension of the production tax credit, a wind energy subsidy, or tax credit for, it says 1 year, but in essence 2 years, because it runs to when you put the shovel in the ground. I mean, getting that passed, when we had every wind energy company up in Congress saying, we will not survive. We will lose 60,000 jobs in the United States if in fact this wind energy tax credit is not extended. And it was a cliffhanger of a fight, and we won it at the 11th hour with extraordinary pain and suffering for a tiny subsidy, in my judgment, by comparison. So I think we've got some pretty strong and entrenched interests who have had the benefit of the subsidies to fossil fuels, and it's quite hard. The reason we're talking about price signals are, we've got to somehow equalize that. We've got to deal with it so renewables aren't at a disadvantage and efficiency at a disadvantage, and coal and nuclear power plants at an advantage. And I think that one way to do it is to take something away, and we certainly ought to try. But another way to do it is make sure that we put the right pricing on dirty fuel, and that will help make renewables more competitive with or without those old subsidies.
The subsidies, are they part of the conversation about carbon?
Well, I mean, they have to, they are part of the conversation. I mean, I do have to engage in a moment of raw flattery, though, that Mindy's the group had, put together the Bicep Coalition, which a lot of the folks on the inside tell me was probably the single most effective thing in terms of getting the production tax credit, advanced, because a lot of them were not the usual suspects. When the guy from Nike, shows up and argues in favor of the production tax credit, it gets their attention. But one thing to just bear in mind, the people who run the oil and the petroleum companies and the coal companies are smart. And what you have is basically a money cycle where they're getting a tremendous subsidy, and they are smart enough to cream off 5% of it and spend it on lobbying to keep the subsidy in place. And one thing that, during the height of the Waxman-Markey debate that Ed Markey used to say to us sometimes was that he thought that in the end, the single most important part of what he was trying to get passed was to generate income from the cap and trade system, which would then be invested in clean energy, just like we've done here in the Northeast with the RGGI program, which puts a price on carbon and then invests the money in energy efficiency. And that he envisioned that 5 years in the future, there would be lobbyists walking the halls of Congress paid for by the clean energy companies who would be supported by that revenue. So it's changing things. All energy is subsidized. The question is, how much and in what manner, and what are the implications of those subsidies?
Well, I think one of my problems as an academic is that we try to look at the actual numbers on some of this stuff. And I guess I make 3 points to you. One is that the reason you have the oil subsidies is not because of Exxon or BP or Shell. It's because of a lot of the small royalty owners who have these small wells on their land. And they're a huge constituency in Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico. And they fight for this all the time because they get money out of it. And it's the most inefficient way to produce oil and gas. But so they have been a big lobby for this. One thing I always stood, when I was in the state, I always thought, my gosh, it was the Exxons in the world that did it. But when I actually got into Congress and I met the Texas Independent Royalty Owners Association, which makes Exxon look like pipers when it comes to lobbying. That's why you have it. Number two, actually the depletion allowance is smaller now than the renewable subsidies. So if you actually look at the numbers in the last 3 years, the renewable subsidies are higher than the oil subsidies. And I think the other problem, though, is if you look at subsidies around the world for fossil fuels, it's worth about $400 billion. It's why when you go to Venezuela and gasoline is 20 cents. You look at subsidies for almost every form of fossil fuel energy in places like China and others. They're all basically controlled and kept low cost. And so you're in a situation in which it's a huge impact. So you've got to deal with the subsidy issue from an international basis, which is being dealt with both the UN and both through, it's been a big issue for the COP, Conference of Parties, which is the global climate regime internationally. And I guess the other thing that I would say, and again I'm going to be unpopular with this, in all the studies that we have done, it says that putting a tax on carbon is a much cheaper way to incentivize renewables than subsidizing renewables, by almost 50%.
I think we have time for one final question over here.
What is the cultural or social impact of climate change here in Brookline?
Of the actual change?
Yeah, over time, over the past decade, generation.
Well, going forward, you know, not to be glib about it, but going forward, if all current trends continue and we don't raise the dams on the Charles, then there's going to be a lot more swimming. Quite literally, in terms of understanding that, the infrastructural cost, they just proposed a big expansion of the Museum of Science. Well, the cost of that is going to be nothing compared with raising it, 20 feet in the air when we have to raise that dam. So, I think, what is the immediate impact? I don't know, but I gotta tell you, if we don't take some real action, not having a downtown Boston to go to work in, and having to deal with a Charles that has overwhelmed the dams, I call that an impact.
I think Mindy wrote an article called Tie Your Boat at Fenway Park.
Yeah.
If all the ice in Greenland and Antarctica melts, I think it's about 60 feet of sea level rise, which would make Brookline's 60 feet on average, I think, 60 feet above sea level. So it'd make Brookline beachfront property.
And we don't have to wait till all the ice melts. We actually, think about Northern Boulevard, hot new place. My husband, as soon as my daughter graduates from high school, he wants to move downtown. Not to the Back Bay, not to the South End, but to, near the federal courthouse, the Seaport area. So we're talking about doubling the convention center. We're looking at $10 billion at least of new retail, residential, office space. And we're putting it in a place that is most vulnerable in 10 years or in 5 years to sea level rises. We're talking about people's homes, people's livelihoods, tens of billions of dollars that we don't have to have the worst catastrophe happen. We have to have minor catastrophes happen. So it is starting to impact our lives in many ways. And we need to think about building a movement because we've got a lot of embedded interests who want to keep things the way they are. And I think part of it is going to change from all sorts of numbers and economics and scientific studies. But in the end, I think it is going to take a movement. I'm delighted to see college students who are now finally engaging in climate in a very new and different way. We need to take this out of the ghetto of environmentalism. This is a national security threat of the first order. This is a public health threat. We are seeing disease vectors change. This is an extraordinary economic catastrophe that's not waiting to happen. It is happening, and the science is clear. When have we ever, for the first time in our lives, been thinking about building a future for our kids that is not going to be able to accommodate or allow them to have what we have? We'd each throw ourselves in front of a bus for our children. That bus is roaring down here. We have got to stop this problem. And if we can't do it, and it can't be slow and tedious and forever. So I think the greatest thing about the town of Brookline is that the movement is growing here. And I don't generally use terms like movement, but that's what it's going to take. We have got to move a power base. It has got to look different, feel different, taste different. It has got to be about religion and preserving the world and the earth. It's got to be about economists weighing in, it has got to be about students weighing in, and we've got to let our president know that we need regulations that are going to change things. We've got to let companies that were invested know that we're not going to invest in them anymore. There are things we could do. We need to act sooner rather than later, as in yesterday.
I think that's great for a closing comment. So thank you all for coming here tonight.